Hi, and welcome to Mortal Giants. I'm Sandy Garosino, and this podcast is produced in collaboration with Canada's National Observer. Episode 3, Taiwan Tension.
2023. The horizon dotted by hundreds of cargo vessels. Shadowed by 3 Chinese warships, the Canadian Navy sailed a guided missile frigate through the Taiwan Strait, performing a freedom of navigation exercise. The presence was to show Canada's stance on the Taiwan Strait being international waters despite claims of ownership by China. Southwest of Okinawa, Japan, and northeast of Hong Kong, the waters between the continent of Asia and Taiwan is called the Taiwan Strait. The island of Taiwan and its strait have been battled and fought over since its first invasion and through the last century. But its reunification and strategic significance play a role in China's interest. It's the gateway to the South China Sea, which stretches from Taiwan south to Malaysia. 1/3 of the world's shipping traffic, carrying around 5 trillion in goods, sail its waters every year. There's also the little thing about how it's estimated there are 12 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas in the seabed. But its military value equals the former. It's littered with tiny island chains and coral, perfect for building islands and extending territorial claims throughout the South China Sea.
My co-host is global affairs expert Veena Najibullah, and in this episode, we're talking about China and Taiwan. And hi, Veena, we're finally talking about the big story of Taiwan, one of the most dangerous flashpoints in global politics today. It's the center of attention around China and the U.S. and America's Indo-Pacific strategy. The most common forecast says that Xi Jinping is firmly on the path to invade Taiwan within the next few years, while the U.S. says it's going to defend the island. Are we on the path to war?
It's a huge question, but maybe briefly. I don't believe that the war between China and the U.S. over Taiwan is either imminent or inevitable. In other words, it can be prevented, but a lot will depend on what we'll do.
Can you just lay out for us the story of China's relationship with Taiwan and why it matters?
Absolutely. So Taiwan and China have a long history. During the Qing dynasty in the late 17th century, Taiwan was part of the Qing dynasty for about 200 years. But then in the First Sino-Japanese War, China, the Qing dynasty, lost control of that territory to Japan. So Taiwan was also a colony of Japan until the end of World War II. In China itself, the Qing dynasty lost power. Republic of China was established in 1912, and the Republic of China was in the mainland China until 1949, and then they lost the civil war between the PRC and the Kuomintang, and those
the Communist Revolution.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the CCP took over mainland China and Kuomintang, and 1.2 million people escaped and based themselves on the island of Taiwan. So the Republic of China was based on the island of Taiwan, and then PRC was the mainland China. That began in 1949. And of course, Republic of China out of Taiwan was recognized as official China until 1971 by the United Nations. It was only in 1971 that PRC became China at the UN, and Republic of China was kicked out of the UN.
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you right there because I have a question for you now.
Sure. I mean, that's a lot of history, but I'm just kind of setting the scene.
That's a lot of history, and flashing before my eyes are The Last Emperor, all the movies that we've seen that kind of tell this story in different bits and pieces. But I want to just rewind the tape a little bit, Veena, because when the UN was formed and the security
in 1945,
and the Security Council was formed, and the 5 permanent members,
so Russia, US, France, UK, and Republic of China.
And just to frame this a little bit more and why this matters is that the permanent members of the UN Security Council have veto power.
Of course.
So as the Security Council was being set up, it was never anticipated that communist China would hold the veto power.
It wasn't the PRC that was at the table in 1945 when the current world order was established. So if you kind of think of today's world order, which is crumbling, and that's a topic of another conversation, that whole system of the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions, everything that we know today was formed with Republic of China at the table. basically the tensions between PRC and ROC, or between mainland China and Taiwan, are an unfinished civil war. So you have to think about them in political terms. This is an unfinished civil war where one side, in this case, Republic of China, for the longest time claimed that they were the only China, and mainland China said, we are the only China, and that included Taiwan. And it was in the 70s, once PRC joined the UN, and once in 1979, the US recognized PRC, that some of the ambiguities were introduced into the system, meaning that China has something called one China policy. And it says there's only one China, Taiwan is part of it, and PRC is the only legitimate government.
Apart from its symbolic importance, does Taiwan matter strategically to China?
Yes, Taiwan matters both symbolically, as you mentioned, in terms of China kind of reestablishing the Greater China of the Qing dynasty, bringing together Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So when PRC came to power, they promised the Chinese people that they were going to rejuvenate the nation and bring back all the lands that they lost through the century of humiliation. And they already have Xinjiang, they have Tibet, they have Hong Kong, so the only one left is Taiwan. So that, for China, that's what's important.
Century of humiliation is what?
Century of humiliation is basically the time when China lost a number of wars to Japan and also to the UK, and was essentially controlled by Western powers and also Japan. And it's a time which in the Chinese context is seen as China was the weakest. It had the Opium Wars, if you remember, and all of that. So it's a period of time that has left quite a bit of national trauma in the psyche of Chinese people and Chinese government. Bringing back Taiwan into China kind of has been a through line through the Qing dynasty to the PRC now. In addition to that, obviously, today, Taiwan also has an incredible strategic importance economically and also geopolitically. Economically, we spoke at a different episode about TSMC and how significant Taiwan is to global economy.
This is the microchips and semiconductors.
Correct. So for the globe, Taiwan is an incredibly important economic center. It produces 90% of all the advanced semiconductor chips, which are important for everything we do now in our lives. And even though it's a nation, island nation of 24 million people, it's the 8th largest trading partner for the U.S. So it's a bigger trading partner than France, for instance, as far as the U.S. is concerned, right? And it's also important because a lot of trade goes through the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, and control over Taiwan matters from that perspective as well.
But it also is a military objective, as I understand, for China, in the sense that if people just want to pull up a map of the first island chain, why does this island chain matter?
Yes.
What is it? Like, that's a big ocean. There's lots of room for boats.
Okay, so you're absolutely right. In the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 40s, it didn't really matter. The kind of island strategy became a thing after World War II and under President Roosevelt, who basically decided or established U.S. maritime dominance in the Pacific Ocean. And as part of the Korea War in the 1950s, and also as part of the Cold War and containing of the Soviet Union, it became really important that Soviet Union did not have force projection outside what then became known as the first island chains, which goes through the north. If you picture kind of the east coast of the Soviet Union, there's the Kamchatka Peninsula. Down, then you have Japan, then further down you have Taiwan, then further down you have Philippines, and then you have Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, right? So that entire chain of islands essentially served as a barrier for Soviet naval projection into the wider Pacific, because the waters are connected, but these islands are blocking them, and there are only so many passageways out of the island chains into the wider Pacific. There are actually 3 island chains. The one that I just described, which encompasses Taiwan as kind of the middle portion of it, is the first island chain. Then we have the second and the third, and the third one includes Hawaii. This is all important for maritime security and maritime force projection of the US and initially the Soviet Union, but now with the end of the Cold War, it's become relevant to China because China is similar to the Soviet Union. If you kind of picture again the map,
behind that island chain.
It's behind, meaning that its access to the wider Pacific is blocked by these island chains. So it creates vulnerabilities in terms of choke points for blocking trade, maritime trade, but also if there were to be a naval conflict, then access to the wider Pacific will matter. And the U.S. currently has a dominant hand in that, and it'd like to maintain that and deny China opportunities for any kind of preemptive or preventive kind of first action in those waters.
And the U.S. has military bases all along that first island chain.
Correct, with Japan being quite significant, yes. Philippines being another one. So actually, like if you think General McCarthy back in the 50s again called Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier, because when you wage a war, air superiority matters, and to establish air dominance, you need to have fighter jets. And fighter jets need something to take off from and to come back to refuel and to have maintenance. For that, you can have aircraft carriers in the sea, but those can be sunk. An island is much harder to sink and can serve as that kind of a base. So unsinkable aircraft carrier, that's kind of how Taiwan became strategic from a military perspective. For the U.S., in order to maintain freedom of navigation, in order to maintain its economic prosperity, it needs to ensure that China doesn't become the dominant naval power in the Pacific and does not get control of the South China Sea. So China claims that 90% of the waters of the South China Sea, its territorial waters.
And it's been engaging in all these other efforts around the Spratly Islands and these other
Paracel
Islands, which people may not recognize these names, but China has been indulging in incredible dredging projects and to build up military bases to create larger islands out of what had been kind of rocky outcroppings.
That's right. Well, it's because South China Sea is extremely contested. Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, China, they all have disputes around which part of the waters is theirs. And China is trying to assert its territorial rights by creating these islands that then it says are its islands, and therefore the waters around it are also its.
And those waters are, that boundary extends like 22 kilometers
Well, 22 kilometers for the territorial waters if you have an island, and then 370 kilometers for the exclusive economic zone. And all of this began, so just to put sort of a little bit of a historical perspective, this is all recent. So it's really in 2012 that China began this process of essentially taking over islands. So like with Scarborough Shoal in Philippines, it was in 2012 that China took control over that. And that's only really 350 odd kilometers away from Manila, right? So it's pretty close to the capital of Philippines and can present a serious threat to the security of Philippines. And same thing with the Paracel Islands, which are off the coast of Vietnam. China now claims that it controls it, and in fact, on one of those islands called the Woody Island, it has established military bases and also has created daily flights to China to assert that there is tourism and actual economic life on the island, which again bolsters its claim that this is a real island and it's a territory of China.
But you're saying you don't feel that war is inevitable, that we're not necessarily on the path to a military confrontation?
Let me actually clarify what I'm saying. War is more likely today than it has been in the last 50 years. However, it's not inevitable or imminent. The situation really is dangerous and is getting more dangerous by the day. But I do believe that through diplomacy and deterrence, it can be avoided. And in fact, my point is, given the enormous consequences of a war on global economy and on peace and security, we better do everything possible to prevent it. Because even based on like some conservative estimates done by the Rhodium Group, which is a consulting firm out of the US, even just a blockade of Taiwan would cost about $3 trillion to the world economy. So imagine what a war would be, right? So, I mean, we're talking about something that would just be so awful and disruptive to everything that we know that we best avoid it. That's my position. And I think it's too cavalier to just kind of say, oh, well, a war is going to happen in 2 years. We should even start a war just to kind of get ahead of it, right? Like, it's just too irresponsible to move down that road, which means we got to do everything we can to reinforce deterrence. So to make Taiwan strong enough, the parlance, it means the porcupine strategy. So make Taiwan so unswallowable by China that it doesn't try. And at the same time, engage in diplomacy to reassure China that it doesn't have to invade Taiwan. So there are a couple of red lines that China genuinely has about Taiwan. I mean, it does a lot of posturing, but ultimately two things. One is de jure independence. So if Taiwan were to declare independence tomorrow. And two is if U.S. reestablish its defense commitment, an actual defense agreement, which it used to have until normalization of relations with China, with Taiwan. We need to have deterrence, which means Taiwan needs to spend more money on defense, and both in terms of preventing an invasion, but also dealing with something known as the gray zone tactics, and we can go back to that in a minute, which means things short of an invasion, but other course of actions that are happening. And then we also need more diplomacy with China to know not just their capability, because I think by the end of this decade, Xi Jinping is committed to having the capability to invade Taiwan. That doesn't mean that he will have the intent to do so. So we have to do everything possible to stop that.
Is he not signaling that he intends to do so, though?
He's signaling that reunification is important and that it's an unfinished agenda that ought to be finished by 2049 is kind of the ultimate deadline. But some folks have confused the 2027, which is a deadline for PLA, the People Liberation Army, to have the capability to do so. So the 2027 is a timeline when Xi Jinping wants basically his military to be able to take Taiwan by force. That's, I mean, it's still a desire. I mean, they may not achieve it, but that's why that timeline gets thrown around and people feel very nervous about that. But it doesn't mean that he would do so by force, because I think China's preferred reunification pathway has always been a peaceful one, induced through economic co-option, basically, which is why for the number of years they wanted to deepen economic connections with Taiwan to essentially make Taiwan see that China is their only option for economic prosperity. And until 10 years ago, 70% of Taiwanese trade was with mainland China. It's only recently that they're trying to diversify and reduce their dependence on China, but that still stands at about 50%.
Is there a diplomatic solution?
So I think we would need to separate the kind of the diplomacy that's needed with respect to maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and the relations between Taiwan and China. And then diplomacy that's needed to manage China's broader ambitions in the South China Sea and also in the Pacific and as a naval superpower. I think they're slightly different. There are areas where they intersect, but we need to see these as separate diplomatic challenges. So with respect to Taiwan, I think, yes, there are ways in, again, engaging in both deterrence and diplomacy. So it can't just be one or the other. We do need to make sure that Taiwan is prepared to defend itself, and we do need to make sure that other countries are committed to maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So one thing that China really wants to do, it wants to make the issue a bilateral issue, just kind of an internal issue between Taiwan and China, or PRC. What US and Canada and Japan and the EU and others need to do is internationalize the issue and say that they're all invested and have a stake in maintaining peace and stability for all the reasons we mentioned in terms of its economic importance and all the rest of it. And that is part of that collective deterrence that's needed, because Taiwan alone cannot defend itself against PRC, even if it spends all of its resources on defense, right? It's a genuine sort of David and Goliath story. It's
far
tiny.
too dominant. And China has been militarizing and arming itself, its naval capabilities, everything. It's been massively upgrading its own capabilities in the Pacific. What is the scenario if there's military conflict between the U.S. and China? Now the world's greatest military superpowers. It's
a difficult thing to contemplate, because we would be in an unprecedented situation. I mean, obviously we have conflicts right now in Ukraine and in the Middle East, but a confrontation...
They're contained. They're small.
A confrontation relatively, not for the folks on the ground, but globally speaking, a confrontation between U.S. and its allies, presumably Japan, Australia, and others, and China in the South China Sea or over Taiwan would be the kind of conflict that the world has not seen really since World War II, if not earlier. So it is in everyone's interest to prevent that. But we have to also consider that even though I think an actual full-on war is not likely or imminent, there are other things that are much more risky. A blockade or some kind of a course of action around internet cables around Taiwan, right?
Yes.
Like, there are a number of other things that can happen that would be quite disruptive and that are more likely, and we need to be prepared for those as well. And as far as Taiwan is concerned, and the 24 million people living in the democratic nation of Taiwan, they have to contend with daily cyber attacks from PRC. I mean, they have to contend with a massive campaign of disinformation and influence. So it's not just an invasion that's the issue. It's that there is now a multidimensional threat and a challenge that Taiwan has to deal with PRC. And we, as Taiwan's partners and allies, have to be mindful of that and help them with. So it's not just preventing an invasion, like a kind of D-Day, another Normandy of PRC troops and landing on Taiwan shores. It's all sorts of other ways in which PRC is currently threatening and undermining Taiwan, both as a democracy and as a society. That needs to be a concern.
FBI Director Christopher Wray says China's multi-pronged cyber assault is the defining threat of our generation. There are 5 million cyber attacks every day, and Taiwan is ranked one of the biggest targets for foreign disinformation in the world. Taiwanese politicians and researchers say the majority of those attacks originate from China.
In the context of Taiwan, again, we have to remember that at first the island was very much a dictatorship and had a one-party system and a martial law and the era of white terror. So things were really not quite great in Taiwan. But it was in 1991 that Taiwan became a democracy, and since then has had genuine elections, which are representative and contested, and two major parties, the KMT, which is the Kuomintang, the originals that came from PRC, but it also has the Democratic People's Party, which I guess is the one that really led to the democratization of Taiwan, and that's the party that's currently in power. So Tsai Ing-wen.
Are they at risk?
For now, they look like they're leading in the polls, and Tsai Ing-wen herself cannot run, but her vice president is the candidate. And then the KMT, which I think China would prefer, is actually the third party now, because there's a third party that has entered, a populist party, a TPP, and surprisingly, they're still number two. There's a lot of conversation about potentially the KMT and the TPP merging forces.
And what could but how could these elections change the outcome of what's happening?
Well, I think for China, the way it's being presented on the ground, KMT is basically presenting it as an opportunity for peace or war. They basically say that if you elect the same party that's currently in power, the one that is closer to the U.S. and democratic allies and quite antagonistic with mainland China, that it will force China to escalate and to potentially lead to war. Whereas obviously the DPP believes that the only party that fully understands the threat environment and the real challenge that PRC is DPP, right? They basically say that KMT is too naive.
So there's a party that wants to lower the temperature and hopefully deter China, not by being aggressive, but by being a good pet.
It's a much more complicated conversation. We can have a whole episode about political dynamics and parties and elections in Taiwan. But shorthand, basically, KMT, which last time they were in power was 2008 and 2016, they believe that they can deal with China and PRC and have diplomatic contacts and essentially prevent escalation by talking to PRC.
Okay.
And DPP does not, because obviously they feel that with China at this point will be deterred only through actual strength and deterrence and partnerships with allies, and also some diplomacy, which China rejects in this case, PRC rejects.
How has the situation in Hong Kong impacted Taiwan's attitudes about reunification with the PRC?
It does, because one of the kind of promises that PRC had made was that reunification could happen under one country, two systems, that if Taiwan were to reunify, it could still maintain some of its democratic values under this two-system arrangement. Well, Hong Kong has completely ended that myth, because what's happened in Hong Kong is that there is no two systems. Hong Kong has been fully absorbed into PRC and has lost all of its freedoms, and we saw that through the protest movement and so forth. So I think what has happened in Hong Kong has had a profound impact on how an average Taiwan citizen sees prospects of reunification. The level of support for reunification in Taiwan is tiny. It's about 6%, right? Majority of people of Taiwan, majority of the 24 million people want to maintain status quo, want to maintain their de facto independence, and want to maintain their freedoms and their democracy. And they don't believe that mainland China would agree to that. And they point to Hong Kong as a prime example.
As the perfect example. Here's Exhibit A.
Exactly.
This is the future that awaits us.
Precisely.
And then we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
What has happened in Ukraine has had real significant impacts in how people inside Taiwan view the situation and how others, particularly certainly Europeans and to some extent Americans, view this problem. Before Ukraine, most people thought that like an invasion of a small country by a big country was something of a 20th century problem, that it was not something that we had to deal with today. Well, Russia and Ukraine showed that no, that's very much a 21st century reality, and that this could also happen in Taiwan. So in fact, Japan has said, Ukraine could be Taiwan tomorrow, which means that people are much more serious about the fact that we need to have a strategy for defending Taiwan. The idea that every single Ukrainian citizen wanted to fight for their independence and has bravely joined the fight has really inspired people in Taiwan. So I was in Taiwan this past June, and one of the things that people were really talking about is this kind of civil defense and courses and learning and understanding what it would look like for every person in Taiwan to be invested and to fight for their own independence, and recognizing that only if you do that, then others can come to your help. Because the contrast to that is Afghanistan.
Yes.
Right. And after 20 years of the war on terror and the occupation and everything that had happened, the will to fight was no longer there. And the international support also didn't materialize. Right. So the fact that people of Taiwan need to have agency and be sort of at the forefront of the fight for their own independence, I think is sinking in because of what's happening in Ukraine. And that's a really important thing.
How should we support? Yes. What should our Indo-Pacific strategy be?
Even though we have a one China policy and we don't have official diplomatic relations with Taiwan, we have really close economic, cultural, and people-to-people ties. And I believe we can be doing more with Taiwan even under our current one China policy, that we don't need to be too cautious and conservative. Historically, governments in Ottawa have been really cautious, in my view, in how we approach Taiwan. Yep. And I think we need to be a little bit more ambitious. Taiwan is has huge economic potential, and we can have an economic partnership. So finalizing our trade agreement with Taiwan, hopefully before the end of this year, is critical. Deepening that economic tie, technological ties, people-to-people ties. So bottom line, we need to be more ambitious with respect to Taiwan and less fearful about Beijing's reaction. Number two is, with respect to our Indo-Pacific strategy, yes, Taiwan is a big part of it because in part we're interested in deepening relations with Southeast Asia, with ASEAN, and I think Taiwan can be a helpful partner in that as part of us becoming more of a Pacific nation. Because
ASEAN is
the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 countries in Southeast Asia. I think what Canada is doing as part of freedom of navigation operations with the US is important. We are not a huge military or naval power, but we do send frigates and we should continue to do so. But we should bear in mind that we need to be prepared in case there is some tensions with China, because China is now actively pursuing these naval operations, and it's intense. So we need to do more of that, but we need to also be cognizant of the risks involved and have a lot more investment in our defense, in our foreign policy, and just sort of overall approach to the region. In other words, it's not enough just to kind of say we care, we want to be involved, we want to be a reliable partner. It's a tense part of the world, and we need to be smarter with how we engage.
You've been listening to Mortal Giants, conversations about global power and risk with Veena Najibola and me, Sandy Garosino. This has been a Teeny Turner production in collaboration with Canada's National Observer. It was researched, written, hosted, and produced by me, Sandy Garosino, and Eric Chapman. Editing, sound design, and engineering by Eric Chapman, with special thanks to Sandra Bartlett and Linda Solomon of Canada's National Observer. Please subscribe and share on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Tell your friends and give us a rating. That's how we build an audience. And why not subscribe to Canada's National Observer? That way you won't miss a thing.